All right, shall we begin?
Yeah, I think so. Welcome, everybody. So glad that everyone could join us. We had to reschedule, but I think it might have worked out better for some folks.
I'm gonna put it back.
I'm Lisa Adams. We have Anna Wilkins here, also our Executive Director from North County Land Trust. And we're excited to have this conversation. It's something that I know Anna has been wanting to do after speaking with Eva Mosley there. This is a really interesting topic that is of interest certainly to land trusts, but to individual towns, you know, of interest to a multitude of different groups, whether it's cemeteries, etc. So for all of us here, I'm glad that you could be here with us. You can see here, you probably already saw some information about Eva herself here. If Eva, you want to wave your hand there, we've got Eva with us. And then also a friend of the organization. Are you on the board as well, Candace? Or you're
I am on the board, yes.
Okay, so another board member, Candace Curie, with us as well. And they're going to be helping us with this presentation. But North County Land Trust is just very interested in being able to show you and bring this conversation to you. I think, well, maybe not.
Well, I'll just say that it's a great topic, and I'm curious about learning more as well. So it's also a learning thing for me. I have puppies in the background. I'm going to mute myself. They're wrestling right now.
So that was a great transition, because just a little housekeeping, just so you all know, it is being recorded because I had several people that wanted to be able to look back at this who weren't able to make it. So we are recording it. But if you want to, while the conversation is at least first starting maybe and going through the initial presentation, if you want to mute yourself, you can. You can also take yourself off of the video if you're not comfortable with that as well. Hopefully we have no issues. There's no bad weather today, I don't think. So hopefully we have no interruptions with our internet connections, but again, it's being recorded. So if so, you can look back again. Just a little bit about North County Land Trust. I hope you're all aware. I think I know most of the people here, but North County Land Trust, obviously a regional land trust, working with conservation in mind, right? We've got a really big fun project happening right now, a big conversation that we're having with folks about the south slope of Mount Watatic. If you haven't heard more, we'll go back to that later. But obviously we work to conserve the characteristic land that we have in this area. So thank you all for joining us. And I think I'm going to stop right there. What do you think, Candace? Are you ready to take over with your screen?
Sure. Should I request to share?
Absolutely. It should allow you. How did it go? Here we go. Thank you all. Enjoy.
Okay, Eva.
So we're going to be talking about green burial about why some people prefer it, how it's different from conventional burial, and for that matter, cremation. And then after the talk, we will have time for questions. So this is more or less what we'll be talking about. What is it? Is it safe? Is it legal? Can you have it in your town? And we'll try to more or less answer those questions. So here are two pictures of two very different cemeteries. One on the left is the sort of standard conventional lawn cemetery with, usually they have about 1,000 burials per acre. The one on the right, which is Green Springs in New York State, is a green cemetery. And as you can see, it hardly looks like a cemetery. Now in the middle there, you can see a mound, and that is a grave. Although it looks very different from the other graves, and we'll talk about that mound later. So the next slide. So again, on the left is a burial in process or being made ready. The left is a conventional cemetery. That is a vault. And when that's the vault down there and the lid, and when the burial is about to happen, the casket will be placed on these struts and will be lowered into the box. This is the thing below is a box, actually a concrete or metal box. Then the lid will be slid over and the whole thing will descend into the ground about 6 feet. On the right, you can see it looks very different. One is sort of high tech and one is very low tech. It's just a hole with the soil that was removed is right next to it. There's some boards that will hold the body or the box, whichever it is, before people with just ropes or straps will lower the coffin into the hole. So it's different technology, and you can even say it's different culture. And I'll mention here, but I think it'll come up again, that in green burial, everything that goes into the ground has to be biodegradable, which is clearly not true of the conventional burial. So the big differences between the two are the containers and embalming. Chemical embalming is not required routinely in any state, but some states have some requirements in certain circumstances, but Massachusetts does not. So there is no, I mean, if you want it, it's available, but there is no legal requirement to have embalming. Although many funeral homes require it for a viewing. So if you're going to use a funeral director, that is one consideration. One of the ingredients in embalming fluid is formaldehyde, which is a preservative, but it's also a carcinogenic. It's on the EPA's list of the 10 most hazardous chemicals. Is carcinogenic both for humans and for animals. So on the lower picture, those are vaults getting ready to be used. They are, I believe, not in their graves yet. They're just being stored. And most conventional cemeteries now require an outer container like this. You know, as I said before, the coffin, the casket goes into this extra box. And the point is to prevent the size of the grave from collapsing. The grave is dug ahead of time and it may collapse some before the body is put in. To reduce the risk of cave-ins later when heavy equipment and mowers drive over the grave, and also to help maintain a flat, level lawn. Depends how much you value that particular benefit. The caskets, there's a casket up there on the right, and you've mostly seen them before. They're very heavy, very fancy, fairly expensive. And they are made either of metal, which doesn't biodegrade, but eventually it will corrode and fall apart, which is not particularly good for the soil. Or it may be of some hardwood such as oak or mahogany. Mahogany should not be cut down probably at all. And although it will biodegrade, the varnishes and other finishes will eventually leach into the soil. And then the fabrics used for the linings may be artificial and also not so great for the soil. So these conventional caskets are designed to protect the body. That's a quote from funeral director's literature. From the elements, but of course, everything will eventually decompose and fall apart. But what happens in a casket, especially a sealed casket, or somebody called it a casket with a gasket, is, well, let me read from this book called Grave Matters. Unlike their oxygen-fueled aerobic bacteria, the anaerobic bacteria attack the body's organic matter by putrefying it, turning soft body tissues to mush and bloating the corpse with foul-smelling gas. In fact, it's methane. So, of course, all this happens after it's put into the ground, and people are not aware of it. But what happens with green burial is very different. We'll get to that later. So I guess we're ready for the next slide. What about cremation? So cremation uses fossil fuels. The body and its the container of it's also burned, burns for 2 to 3 hours at 1600 degrees Fahrenheit, which is really hot. So it uses a lot of fossil fuels, carbon dioxide and other emissions, pollute the air. One of them is mercury from dental fillings. I tried to find out from my dentist whether they still use mercury. I think not, but a lot of old people like me still have mercury fillings. And what happens is in the heat, the mercury is gasified. And then as it cools in the air, it becomes mercury again, and then it may fall into ponds and streams. Fish eat, ingest it, and which is why often we're told not to eat the fish. The remains of cremation, or cremains as they're called, are made of bones. So they're mostly dry calcium phosphates with some other minerals, salts of sodium and potassium, for instance. And so they're not really good for plants. So they probably don't do a lot of harm, but they are not a good fertilizer. Okay, next slide. So why might you choose green burial? If I haven't put you off totally with the other two possibilities, here on the right, you can see a green burial about to happen or being prepared. And probably the body, in this case, I think it's just a body in a shroud, will be put on those the stringers, the boards across the grave. During the ceremony, there are people in the back that are obviously waiting to speak and sing and listen and so on. Now, some religions, especially Judaism and Islam, already do something like green burial, with some variations, some real differences, as well as nature-based religions. And those who are philosophically aligned with reverence for the earth, and I guess I'm one of those, and you can ask me about it later if you wish. And often, along with green burial, people take care of the body themselves without a funeral director, or they let the funeral home just do the paperwork and maybe transport the body from the hospital. You should try, if you're looking for a funeral director, you should try to find one who lets you pay for what you want and not make you pay for what you don't want. People who take care of the body themselves want to reclaim the whole death ritual and the whole process of dealing with the body from the professionals. Not everybody wants to, but many people do. So you still need the proper paperwork, death certificate and so on. And someone has to transport the body. But as I implied, you don't need a funeral director. Not everybody wants to do it themselves. As far as cost is concerned, it varies a great deal from one green burial ground to another. There are some that are part of land trusts, and when you buy a plot, about half of the cost is actually a donation to the land trust. So it's tax deductible and it helps keep the land trust going. Let's see. So a lot of what what seems to go with green burial, this idea of doing it yourself. A lot of people want to be part of, they want to be doing something that that helps the process along. And apparently it also helps with, I've never been involved yet, but it helps people with their grieving, that they are involved, it's real. It's not like the usual funeral or memorial service where there's either a gussied up viewing, body for viewing, or just, which makes it all rather abstract. So of course you can have, you can do it yourself and not have a green burial, and you can have a green burial without doing it yourself. But the two seem to go together very well. Next slide. So unlike conventional burials, as in most cemeteries in this country, green burial is a way of returning bodies to the earth ecologically, because as I said, everything has to be biodegradable. The way we used to bury our dead in the US before handing it over actually the whole funeral industry is fairly new since the Civil War. Women used to wash and dress the body and made the coffins, and the family and friends waked with the body and then transported it to the cemetery, to a churchyard, or to the back 40. A lot of farms had their own little burial enclosures right near the house or off in the field somewhere. So green burial, it protect worker safety because the gear is much simpler and lighter, conserves valuable natural resources, reduces carbon emissions, and contributes to preservation and sometimes restoration of habitat. So next slide. So some green cemeteries don't allow any markers at all. They use GPS. If you want to find a grave, they can tell you that. I don't know. I know something bounces off a satellite, but I don't know much about GPS. But some do allow markers, and they nearly always have to be either wood or a flat local stone. So it's flat wood to the ground. No, none of the sticking up kind of monumental stones. And some green cemeteries, but not all, allow family and friends to dig the grave. And many allow them to close the grave, that is, after the body is lowered, or maybe even to lower the body, and after the body is lowered, to shovel the soil in to fill the hole. The depth is shallower than the usual, the so-called 6 feet under. At 6 feet, there isn't much bacterial and other critters aren't very active if they're there at all. And so Vermont, for instance, a few years ago, revised the laws so that you can now bury at 3.5 feet. So 3.5 feet is the bottom of the container or the shroud. And at such shallower depths, you get the right temperature and moisture levels for the aerobic bacteria. That's the ones with oxygen, not the ones I read you about before. And so decomposition occurs more quickly, and it's also, the result is more wholesome. It's really like composting. And if you've ever composted, you know what you get is soil, which is good for growing plants. So part of the cycle of life and death. So in Green Springs, which we saw earlier, they mound the soil. There's a much nearer cemetery in southern Maine called Cedar Brook, where they don't mound the soil, but they just level the grave and they keep filling it in afterwards as necessary. Okay, next slide. So containers for green burial. So as I said, they have to be biodegradable. So up on the left, on the upper photo, that is a plain pine box. And I should think any carpenter could make a plain pine box and could make it to fit the person who's going to be in it. Below that is a wicker basket. Caskets, that's a basket. It's quite beautiful. I don't know whether it's much more expensive. I have no idea. I'm aiming for a plain pine box myself. And on the right is a cardboard box, cardboard coffin. And it comes from Morning Dove Studio in Arlington. But Green Burial, yes, we actually have a supply of those. So if you go to our website, we'll talk about that at the end. You can buy one from us, and half the price is a donation to Green Burial, Massachusetts. And below that is, I think it's the same shrouded body that we saw before. So it's simply wrapped in a cloth and tied up and with flowers. And flowers are optional, of course. So there, one second. Oh, the one advantage of the cardboard box, which is not true of the wicker, although it could be true of the pine, is that you can write on it and you can draw pictures and you can paint on it. And a lot of families do that, and they send messages to the deceased, or, you know, just expressing how they feel or writing about memories. So it's very nice that way, whether or not you believe that the dead will somehow get to see or read those things. It's a good thing for the living. Okay, let's go on to the next. Now, safety. In general, once a person dies, any infectious agents, including those on the skin or internal organs, are, well, the danger is here, it says, is greatly diminished. In most cases, I believe it's like a parasite. It dies when the host dies. And the body is innocuous very soon. But it's a little more complicated with COVID-19. Although the World Health Organization has said those bodies may be buried or cremated as the family wishes, and there's no known risk associated with it. The World Health Organization says, maybe after more experience, that embalming is not recommended. Of course, we're not recommending it anyway, but this is another reason that embalming may not be a good choice, because to avoid excessive manipulation of the body, embalming is very intrusive, because I think I read to you, it drains out all the bodily fluids and replaces it with embalming fluid. So that takes a lot of cutting and handling the body. So we're still learning about the coronavirus and its impact on both the living and the dying. But those working with the body, if it's amateurs, in the case of Green Burial, it's a good idea to cover the face of the dead body with a mask, especially when moving it, because there's a possibility that air would be expelled, and that air could still be, if it's soon after death, it could still be contagious. There's also some information that it might be a good idea to put the bodies into a body bag, even in a green burial. Lee Webster of the Green Burial Council, which is a national organization that certifies green cemeteries and does a lot of advocacy and education. And so Lee Webster says, we're not going to worry about a few plastic body bags. They don't decompose, but they will fall apart. So that's a bit of a compromise there in green burial, but in view of the dangers of COVID-19, I guess we have to be careful. So next slide. The Green Burial Council certifies 3 levels of green cemeteries. And one is hybrid. And here are two examples of hybrid cemeteries. One is the town cemetery that is going to have a new section next to it, which will be green burials. The other on the right is Mount Auburn, which is said to be in Cambridge, but it's really mostly in Watertown, has green burials where the pointer is. There are 15 graves there. And it used to be a path, and they realized that nobody was using the path, so they decided to put people in there. They're in among the, as you can see, the conventional graves. Mount Auburn is the oldest garden cemetery in this country, if not the world. And it's a very beautiful place. But as you've seen, the green cemeteries are beautiful in a different way. So, and along with these 15 graves, which are really not marked themselves, there is a big stone marker which lists all the people who are buried there. So that's one level. The next is green or natural cemeteries, which is what I've been talking about. And then there's conservation cemeteries where the land is being preserved by a land trust. And there are a few of those around the country now, and we're trying to start a new one in Massachusetts. This one with the military people is Ramsey Creek in South Carolina. And this is actually the granddaddy of the modern green cemeteries. It was the first one started, at least in this country, by a doctor and his wife. They own a lot of land, and they got the idea, and they have been burying people this way now for quite a while. And there are apparently more than 200 green burial places of various kinds in 40 different states. So we're making a lot of progress. For now, the nearest one to us is I think I want the next slide.
Nope. There, I'm gonna back up. Cedarbrook.
That's the one I want. So this is a picture of Green Springs. It's south of Ithaca, and it's not connected with the land trust. There were some Cornell professors got together and pooled their money for a down payment and bought this big piece of land, 100 acres or more. It's a lot cheaper than land is around here right now. But still it's a lot of land, and it's a very beautiful place. Has a Jewish section. I think when I went there, they were talking of having a Muslim section. They didn't yet, but maybe by now they do. And so it's just, it's a fully green cemetery. And on the right is Cedar Brook. And that's in Maine, a few miles due west of Portland, just south of the big lake there. I forget, is it Sebago? And it's part of a man named Peter something owned this 150-acre tree farm, and he decided to devote it's less than 3 acres, 2.5 acres or so, to green burials, and he's buried there himself. And so it's a lovely place, but we're still working on starting one in Massachusetts, one that's open to all. There are quite a few towns that are doing it, and if any of you are interested in trying to persuade your town to allow green burial, either in a new cemetery or in a, as part of a conventional one, someone from Green Burial, Massachusetts can help you with dealing with all the issues that, there are quite a few issues. You have to get the permission of the Board of Health, and you have to persuade people that this is really a good thing to do. And you have to, even before that, you have to persuade them that they should be willing to talk about death, which most people are not. So I think that is, oh yeah, let me just tell you a little bit about Green Burial, Massachusetts. So we have been at it for 10 years or more, and have looked at various properties that, you know, some are too wet, some are too expensive, some are too ledgy so that there's not enough soil to bury anybody, some have no access. There are endless kinds of problems, but we're getting there. And we have a volunteer corps. One of the projects that they're doing is a database of towns that do and don't allow green burial, or maybe I should say do and may someday allow green burial. This is a map of your area, and as far as we can tell, none of the towns is in our database yet. So if you have volunteers who would like to contact these, I think there are 13 towns, is that right? Anyway.
There's 14, and actually we're going to be adding 2 more, Shirley and Air. So.
Oh, Shirley, that far east. There's some beautiful places in Shirley. Yeah. And we're always open to more volunteers, and we're also always open to donations, of course. And most of all, we would like to hear about land that may be for sale or to be given for this purpose. So now how do we, I don't know how we manage the questions.
I'm going to stop sharing the screen unless somebody specifically would like to see another picture again.
We are a small group, so feel free to unmute yourself and ask questions of Candace or Eva. Certainly, I've learned a lot, and I know that in terms of, you know, land trust, Eva, I think it's really interesting, maybe your personal story of how you came to this, or how, you know, because Eva's, you know, been a supporter of North County for a while, but she lives closer to Boston. So when we connected, you know, she was very clear, you know, she wants this to happen for herself. She wants to find a place to return to the earth. And you know, when I think about the role of land trusts and the role of land and sustainable use of our land, and the future of our land conservation organizations, I'm intrigued by this idea of, you know, thinking holistically about, you know, our communities, and that even goes through our individual life cycles, and how, you know, returning to nature based solutions. We're looking at nature-based solutions for a lot of things. And this is one that nobody really likes to confront. We kind of get squeamish about, but certainly is intriguing for me. And I'm really glad that you've offered, you know, that we've connected in order to talk about it a little bit more. So how did you come to it, and what's your story, and are you feeling hopeful?
I'm feel you mean on this score? There are a lot of things in this world I'm not hopeful about, but
Okay.
yes, I'm hoping, but you know, I'm about to turn 89, so you know, it's on my mind. It started, I guess, when my mother died in 1971, quite a while ago. And my brother and I, she had been always protected us from any, you know, serious illness or, you know, in other people. And we never visited anybody in the hospital. We never went to a funeral. And so we had no idea what to do. So we went to, we were Jewish, but not, you know, we're secular Jews. And she died at a Jewish hospital, and we went across the street to the Jewish funeral home and were shown all these boxes. And way off in a dark corner, there was this plain pine box with the Star of David on the lid in wood and a little tiny little cushion for the head, nothing else. And I said, I want that. Mm-hmm. And the funeral director said, it's only for the Orthodox. And which is actually, it's kind of a cliche, an unfortunate cliche about Jews that, you know, they're shysters. It's true that the Orthodox have to use that kind of box, but that doesn't mean nobody else can use it. Mm-hmm. So we bought a more expensive box, even though she was going to be cremated. So that, and then, you know, I didn't think about it much for years, but eventually I joined what was used to be called the Memorial Society. It's now Funeral Consumers Alliance. And I found some other people who were also interested, and that's when we started working on it. And also I had some, an exciting encounter with composting. We lived in Vermont for a couple of years. I had a Cub Scout den, and I didn't like a lot of the prescribed activities. So one month I had the little boys make a compost pile. And I had, you know, we had a lot of yard waste and got some lime. And we went to a friend's barn to get fresh cow manure, which is great. And so they made the pile and, you know, saying, yuck, yuck, but they did it. And a couple of days later, I found a metal rod. I stuck it in, and in about 2 seconds, it was too hot to handle. So that was really thrilling to me. And of course, it's not so obvious, I guess, but this is waste. Human or animal, well, it wasn't human waste, it was animal waste, but it does work with human waste as well. And, you know, we just want to get rid of it and get it out of sight. And actually, that's how forests and animals and everything keeps going. It's one of this idea of cycles. And I got the idea of cycles in my youth when I was fascinated with Hinduism. And they don't think in terms of progress traditionally anyway. I'm sure it's all different now, but in terms of cycles, and so that life and death are all part of it, and they're not fighting nature as the way we do, but what they weren't, at least traditionally. So that's sort of my story, and I'm still, you know, still looking, still waiting for that right place. I've seen many beautiful spots that I would have liked. There's one, in fact, in Shirley. The trustees have a newish place. I forget the name. Actually, Candace and I visited it, I think.
Is that far near?
Yes.
Far and near, right?
Yeah.
It's a gorgeous place. And there's this one meadow right along the road and right near where you come in, right? But I haven't yet persuaded them to use it for that. And
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
have their own ideas. So anyway, that's my story.
Now, how much
That's wonderful.
property would you need? I mean, how much land are you looking for?
Well, I think it's sort of the minimum of about 10 acres. Although even, even if you had, and usually you would get a piece of land where you couldn't use all of it. It might be a stream, some of it might be rocky. I mean, after all, it's New England, right? But even at 300 or 500 burials an acre, a few acres would last quite a while. And there's always the question of reusing a gravesite, although I don't always mention that, because people get squeamish about that. Why, do you know of land?
I'm sorry?
We-
I
she
was,
asked if-
I don't know who that was that asked me that. I just wondered if she, do you have or know of land that might be available?
I'm always poking around, so I'll keep you in mind.
Oh, good. That's good.
Yeah.
Lucy,
Eva, Jassy Bratko, I'm sorry. Yes, Jassy Bratko, who also is with us at North County Land Trust. She's our Director of Land Protection, had a question. She said, why do towns not want this to happen? What are the concerns about it? It seems such a natural thing to me.
well, it's hard to answer that because I think there's, I agree that it should be such a natural thing, but people are afraid that, somehow a simple box or a shroud, a body in a shroud is somehow more dangerous than I think it's actually a kind of superstition. I think that I mean, people are afraid of dead bodies anyway, and then if it isn't, doesn't look the way it supposedly did, and I don't know. It does. Maybe Candace has some more ideas about.
Yeah, I can give another viewpoint as well. I worked at Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, and many of the guys I work with, and it was all guys on the interment crew who dug the graves and drove the heavy equipment. And 20, 30, one guy had been there for 40 years. And so all they knew is that you put a concrete box in the ground, and then you put the grave inside the casket inside the concrete box, and then you close it up. And virtually all cemeteries across the state do that, and they all think it's a state law to put the concrete box or a vault in the ground. And it's not. It's almost all, it's a cemetery bylaw. So at some point in time, a cemetery commission or a group of private cemetery trustees decided that, oh, this is a good idea, because they felt it helped reduce landscape and lawn maintenance. So that's always a good thing, to save some money. And so they instituted a grave box or a grave liner or a vault. Those are all similar names for the same type of box that goes in the ground. So at Mount Auburn Cemetery, they started using those things in the 1940s. I am out here in the Berkshires, and in Stockbridge, they started using those things in the 1960s. The towns around you, I'm not sure, but you might find that the bylaws now require the grave liners. Most likely they will say that. And it's just, people think it's state law, but it's not. It's your cemetery law. So often what we recommend is, if you want to have a green burial in your town cemetery, go to the cemetery commission and say, hey, can I have one of these things? And it's a really good idea to plan ahead, which is what Eva's been trying to do for 10 years now. Because sometimes you have to actually go to the town meeting to change the cemetery bylaw. And as you know, trying to deal with land and ownership, it's sometimes not easy to get something passed through a town meeting. So you're right, it is a natural thing to do, and people just get the idea that a dead body is going to bring disease, it's going to bring, a problem to the public water supply or a private well. That is not true. The regional DEP office is responsible for, they do the final rubber stamp if a new cemetery is being created, and they have to work with the local Department of Public Health. So even local public health people don't know that they're responsible for new cemeteries, because we almost never create a new cemetery. So that's one of the things we're coming up against with Green Burial, Massachusetts, is that we find a land, it's almost okay, and the health agent or the Department of Health, they have to contact the state and say, how do we do this? So it's a long process to get these things approved. So the easiest thing is, if you can go to your local town cemetery, if you really want that green burial, start soon.
Oh, go ahead, Ralph. I see you raising your hand.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Eva and Candace. It's such an interesting topic for me. Actually, my wife and I have been looking into this for quite a few years, but not really in a very concerted way. But I did do some research, and we have a 7-acre property. We'd like to have our own little private green burial site on our property. And somewhere I read that in order to do that, because properties can change hands, it would have to be marked out next to the road, so that, in the future, if our family didn't own the place we were buried, then, people could still get to it without crossing the private land. But beyond that, I wasn't able to find anything about setting up a private natural burial site. Do you know anything about that?
Just today, I was looking at the Franklin County, what is it called? FRCOG. I forget what that stands for. The Franklin Regional County of Government.
Yeah.
You can look up green burials there, and they have some excellent materials if you want to create a green burial cemetery for your family on your property. And it's a checklist for Board of Health. It includes that you need to abide by the Massachusetts Rivers Act, which requires if you have a river on your property, you need to be 200 feet from that. But also specifically, you don't need to be near the road for your family burial ground. But what you do need to do is have it professionally land surveyed so that you identify exactly where it is. You might need to fence it off, and you have to file that with your formal deed so that the next person who buys your house knows that they're buying a cemetery. So sometimes realtors will hate to hear that you have a cemetery on your property.
Yes, I can imagine.
Right.
Thank you. That's great. Now, I assume we'd still have to probably get it through the Board of Health.
Yes, you have to check all the boxes, the DEP, the Board of Health.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have a soil evaluator come out and dig down. I think it's down to 10 feet deep. So you have to, have an excavator out there to identify, how close to bedrock are you, make sure that you're not in a seasonal high water table.
I happen to be a soil scientist, so
Oh, perfect. You can evaluate your own site.
Maybe.
DIY soil science.
Would you like to volunteer with Green Burial, Massachusetts?
Actually, I'm no longer an approved soil evaluator. I let that lapse when I retired, but I'd be happy to help you for sure. I could advise you.
Excellent.
Donna, you have a question? Unmute yourself and you can ask.
It's not a question. It's just that I know an attorney who also owns a funeral home, in Fitchburg who did a burial on his property. Right, I believe he lives in Ashburnham or Westminster. His name is John Bosk. He buried his son on his property, so he might be somebody good to talk to because he's been through it and he's also an attorney, so he would know the legal stuff. And he owns the Bosk Funeral Home in Fitchburg.
Wonderful. Thank you.
So
Like, yeah.
Was it a green burial?
I'm assuming it was because he's very down to earth guy. I don't really know this
Literally.
what he did, but he did it, you know.
Mhm.
So,
Thanks. That's a great connection.
yeah.
Any other questions? Do green burials cause any problems for other conservation values? Water protection comes to mind. Can green burials be on conserved land? That's a really good question. What we're told is that once a property is already under conservation, it's hard to add burial into it. So if you're a landowner and you're considering conserving your land, and you're thinking also that you'd like to have burials on it, you got to make sure that's part of the upfront discussion so that it's allowable once it is conserved. And because of the people required to establish the new burial ground with the Board of Health and the regional DEP office, their responsibility is for the public water supply and your private well if you've got a private well. So they're making sure it's properly located and that the soils will properly filter the remains of the body as the body decomposes. So it's actually a perfect marriage between land conservation and having a cemetery. It's really another way to be able to protect your land, you know, in perpetuity theoretically. So they work really well together. And that's one of the things the Green Burial Council did 20 years ago is they said, oh my goodness, this is really the perfect thing. Let's try to conserve all this land all over the nation so that, you know, we can provide burial space, but yet we're still also protecting it as open space. So they work really well together.
I think, you know, certainly now a lot of traditional or conventional cemeteries are, you know, filling up and not, they're
Right.
and they're actually becoming more parks than cemeteries. So they're being used as open space, walking paths, outdoor recreation spaces more so than the traditional cemetery uses. And I think that, you know, that's kind of something we need to think about how over time, how land use change, needs change, and how can we use land so that it's able to transition over the decades and centuries, so that it's fulfilling the needs, whether it's climate change, resilience, green burial space, walking space, open space, agricultural land, whatever, you know, is best needed for the population at that time. And I think, so it's, I always, ever since I started chatting with Eva, I've been thinking about different parcels of land that we have that could be, you know, potential for this. A lot of times there's access issues. You certainly want to be able to get people to the sites and make sure that there's, you know, like you're saying, the right kind of soils, the right kind of aspects, and certainly if we had a land donor who is very interested in donating for that purpose, you know, that's something that I think would be a mutually beneficial project. So just putting that out there for anybody watching the recording or watching it now, if you're so inclined. And yes, Donna.
Scalzione. Hi.
Thank you, sorry.
I do not live in your geographic area. I live in Marlborough, Massachusetts.
Well,
But
thanks for doing this.
first, I want to thank the speakers. It's been very informative. I definitely am going to go that way. In fact, my spouse jokes that when the time comes, she's going to go to Home Depot and buy 2 of those leaf bags, one for the top of me, one for the bottom of me. But a couple of years ago, I wanted to buy a plot, and being a human being, I never did. But I wanted to buy a plot, so I started calling cemeteries that were listed probably on your website. And in Springfield, which is about 40 minutes from here, at that time, it was $2,000 to reserve a plot. But I grew up in Cambridge, so Mount Auburn Cemetery is very dear to my heart. And my parents and many of my family are buried there in traditional graves. I called them and they said $10,000 was their minimum. And then there are other fees on that. So I just wanted to give people a heads up if you don't have your own land, just be aware that there's going to be huge differences in the cost when the time comes.
Right. I actually live a quarter mile from Mount Auburn Cemetery, but I'm not going there. I could afford it, but that's not how I want to spend my money.
Neela, did you have a question or a comment?
I'm sorry.
Did you have a question or a comment? Oh,
Oh,
Neela, we're not able to hear you.
oh, Neela, you're muted or? No.
Oh. Huh, your microphone's not working. It says you're unmuted, but
You want
your
to type it in the chat? We can't hear you.
Oh, good idea, Anna.
are you talking to me?
No,
No.
there's a guest who's trying to communicate with us, but we can't hear her. So she's gonna chat with us in the.
Candace, while Neela's typing, I'm just looping back to the private cemetery idea. Do you know if future owners of that property that have the cemetery on it have to allow access the way sometimes you do these days? We have some property in Maine that has a very, very old cemetery on it. And part of the agreement is, we have to allow access to the.
Yeah, I do not know the proper answer to that.
I wonder if it's something, since you have to note it in the deed, I wonder if that's something. Lucy, do you know if it's attached to your deed?
Oh, it is for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder if that's.
And it's
an
now
arrangement.
And Ralph mentioned being close to the road. I wonder if that's why somebody suggested being close to the road because it's easier access.
Yeah. Over time.
Yeah, access without disturbing the owner.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see.
Well, Anna was talking about the future, the long future, and one of well, actually there are 2 examples of multiple use of the same land, and one is in Wales, where there is a farm with a big hayfield. And they are burying people in the hayfield and they're still haying it. So that to me, that's sort of the ideal, is that you're not only, the thing that appeals, I don't like the idea of death at all. It just makes me sort of angry, but there it is. And assuming that I have to die, which I know, the idea that I can feed the soil has, we couldn't live without soil. That's, you know, along with clean air and clean water, we need fertile soil. And the idea that my body could make some piece of soil fertile, so that it might grow things that somebody else can use, I think is really satisfying.
You know, it's funny, Eva, that you mentioned that, because, you know, when we first talked about doing this green burials, it was right at the start of COVID. And, you know, we were like, oh gosh, are people going to want to talk about it? And I think you're right. There's a stigma associated with death, but like you said, this is also something that we all encounter. So if we are green-minded people, as I believe everyone that's here, and certainly within the land trust, you know, that is something that we pride ourselves on. So I think contemplating these things is a good thing, having these conversations and starting this so that people who want to see it happen can help make it happen. I think that's great. We have to get over that stigma, right?
So Paul, do you want to say something? You can unmute yourself.
Okay. Eva, I appreciate your thoughts on enriching the soil. I'm a retired state botanist, so I appreciate helping the plant world and other critters in the soil. I also wanted to say how much the green burial idea means to me, not only for that reason, but just for the social aspect of it, the grieving and so on. I'm recalling working with my uncle to bury my grandmother in Pennsylvania on our personal family property. And it was a great experience for me as I worked with my uncle digging. I learned all kinds of things about my grandmother that I never knew as we prepared that gravesite for her. So that's another part of that whole experience, I think, that's valuable.
Yeah.
I never really knew my grandmother. She had dementia. And through my whole growing up years, and she lived in a sanitarium in Baltimore. So it was interesting hearing his remembrances that I never learned from my mother, unfortunately, but it was good learning.
That's a great story. Thank you for sharing that. And I don't have a great story like that, but I did. My beloved hound dog passed away in June, and we buried him in my shade garden, and it was very cathartic to dig his grave. It was very cathartic. And
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I've done that for pets. So.
Yeah. So Neela has a great little reflection. I'm sorry we can't connect to your voice, but in the chat, she was at Knobscott Reservation in Sudbury at the smallpox burial site this afternoon for perspective in the midst of a pandemic, and also to see how basic burials were. So you know, that's a great kind of reflection. And you know, I think for those of us who try to live close to nature, we see how separation from nature is really detrimental. And just personally, I gain a lot from my connection to nature and feeling connected to nature. And I think, you know, this green burial concept and also being closer to the process of death and mourning and preparing bodies, and you know, is very intriguing to me, to again reconnect with our human and animal self, you know, and natural self. So that's really great. Yeah.
Yeah.
Any other reflections, or has anybody else, had kind of their own reflection on that process, or a bad experience or a good experience with that process of saying goodbye?
I actually had a thought that, for me, it's always been upsetting to go to a cemetery, especially where they don't encourage or don't allow living plants at the site. So then here we are. I mean, I understand it. It's the maintenance issue, right, that you brought up earlier.
Uh-oh, you're frozen.
Oh,
Mm.
am I frozen still? Am I good?
Oh, no.
Oh, no.
Well, we'll have to imagine what she was going to say. Are you
Am I
there?
back?
Oh, there you are.
Okay, sorry. It's saying my internet connection is unstable. See, I said. No, just that it's upsetting. I understand from a maintenance perspective, that's why they do that. But for me, that's upsetting, and it obviously in a true green burial, that's not the case. And I think we saw different pictures of different examples of, some look like fields even, right? Not even just grass and trees, but fields of flowers and so forth. So I don't know if that's decided on whoever owns that property or not, but that's interesting to me as well, to see, what kind of, what is encouraged around a green cemetery as well, if you know.
Yeah, very intriguing to return to that. All right. Any other questions? Let's see. Yeah, Neela's another thought that she had, not knowing much about Native American burial traditions and wanting to learn more. Candace or Eva, do you know of, does Green Burial draw from any of that, or do you personally know in any of Native American traditions?
I don't, but I'm sure that that they practice green burial. Some of them were semi-nomadic, I think. They moved around, I mean, back and forth. And when somebody is trying to build something, or and the Native Americans say that's sacred ground, and I think, isn't it all sacred ground? Because, and I assume that wherever we build or walk or anything, that there's people buried there somewhere down there. But I don't know. I mean, this latter day green burial movement is certainly part of the environmental movement. I think that that was the impetus for it emerging now. I think now, meaning, beginning in the 90s, probably, maybe a little earlier. I don't know how many of you are old enough to know that a book called The American Way of Death by Jessica Mitford. And she was English, but she married an American, lives here in Oakland. And it was an expose of the funeral industries, both cemeteries, funeral directors, florists, monument makers, the works. And she was a wonderful writer and very witty. And she too says, when she gets to embalming, she said, if you're squeamish, skip the next few pages. But she published her book in 1963, and then there was a posthumous second edition in, I think, 1998. And she doesn't, and I checked because I had read the book, she doesn't mention green burial. And she had her ashes scattered over the Pacific. But I think had she lived a little longer, I think she would have been part of this movement. I think she would have understood. And also, you know, I was thinking when the botanist was speaking that there used to be a standard cliche about pushing up daisies. And I don't know if anybody says that anymore, but there it is. That,
I think Ralph had a question.
Yeah, well, it's not a question so much as a thought about Native Americans. One of the things that I and others around have begun to notice is that there's a lot of peculiar stone features scattered around our landscape, and they're not even that hard to find. And often they're noteworthy in that there's like unusual piles of stones that don't have any real functional purpose that we can recognize. They don't look like they were put there by colonial settlers, though one doesn't really know for sure, but they've been there a long time, covered with lichen and so forth. And it could be that those are marking, in some cases, graves. I mean, there's a lot of people that know about all these stone features, and some of them are very well known in even parts of parks, such as in Upton, a ceremonial stone landscape that I visited as part of the Massachusetts Trails Conference last year. Anyway, just a thought.
I also wanted to read, Neela has another question in the chat. Is it true that the custom of using a headstone and carving dates and names was a Protestant tradition? Do you guys know if that's true?
no, I think it's more general than that.
Yeah.
I've certainly seen it in Catholic cemeteries. So that would be older.
Yeah, I
And
recently.
I think the ancient Greeks, I think had, actually, I'm not sure about that.
Chinese too.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's tomb, look at the Egyptians. I mean, it goes way back.
Yes.
So, sorry, Candace, did I interrupt you? Were you going to say something?
I don't know. No, it's not totally relevant, but there's a lawyer by the name of Tanya Marsh, and she's down in, I think, North Carolina, and she is an expert in cemetery law. And she talks about, particularly here in New England, the laws that we have related to cemeteries have evolved from common law in England. And there was a time when in England, if you were in a pub having a few beers and you died in the pub, it was the pub's responsibility to actually bury you. It had nothing to do with your family. The pub is the one that had to go out and bury you and take care of your body. So it's fairly recent that, you know, families get to take care of their loved ones. And
At least with that British tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Right.
Now in India, the family does the, they don't bury, they burn, but
Right.
Unfortunately, but at least rich Indians get burned, cremated.
Yeah.
So we're nearing our ending time, but I wanted to just ask, what are some of the, if people want to get more involved with Green Burial Massachusetts, or want to, try to approach their Board of Health, or what are the things that, or who should they reach out to, or what are the resources that you guys have that they can
Well,
tap
the
into?
resources are our board members. Candace is, I think, the most experienced because she's worked in the business, although, and in fact, was largely responsible, or maybe entirely responsible, for Mount Auburn Cemetery even having green burial.
Mm.
They had
Partly,
not,
partly.
well, yeah, I'm sure you helped a lot. So I'm sort of the amateur in this crowd, but our president, Judith Lorite, studied to be a funeral director, but gave it up because it was so awful. But she at least knows. And I don't remember whether it was the embalming or something else that put her off. But so it's not. There are good funeral directors too. They're not all. And I mean that's a whole other subject. I don't want to get into that. So I think the thing is to start at the website and there are phone numbers and ways to get in touch with us. And as I say, we always need help with the database of towns. As you know, there are 351 cities and towns in Massachusetts, so it's a big job. And also, of course, it changes. If you call up a town and say, or cemetery commission, do you allow green burial? And they say no. But then they've heard about it, and maybe they hear from a member in the town, and then maybe a year later the answer would be yes. So it's an ever-changing thing. So we're having a volunteer meeting on January 14th. That would be a way for, since anybody can join by Zoom, I guess, right?
Mhm.
To find out more about what's going on and how to help or how to get help. I mean, both are necessary.
Excellent.
Yeah. In 2014 or 2013, Chesterfield, Massachusetts was the only town that allowed green burial. And then Mount Auburn added it in 2014. And since then, we now have about 24 cemeteries that allow green burial. And it's really because residents have contacted their local folks and said, hey, I want to have a green burial. What do I need to do? So if you know you want to be buried in your local cemetery, and most people do in fact like to be buried near where they've lived their lives. So if you want that, you need to plan for it. And on the other spectrum, if you think this is a fabulous way to help conserve land, then I'm so glad that a land trust has hosted this, because it's so important for you when you can go out to a new potential client and say, yes, and what do you think about green burial? Would you be willing to have this on your property? It's another conversation to have with people. And it's not typically done by land trusts. So we're so grateful that you invited Eva to speak today.
Yeah, and thank you for joining us for this.
It's great.
It's been a long time coming, and I'm super. I'm really happy to bring it to the fore. It's kind of, it makes a lot of sense.
Right? Why not?
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Like, why not? Exactly. So, let's see. Any last questions or thoughts, Lisa? Do you want to?
Yeah, no, I was going to say exactly what you were just saying, which is it felt like a very natural conversation for us to have. I know that, as a land trust, we like to listen to the people that are part of our organization and love learning more about things like this. So thank you, Candace and Eva, very, very much for being here and being part of this.
And Lisa, do you want to put up on your screen the slide with all the resources and contact?
I will, and just so everyone knows, I will send, all of you will get a link to this recording if you want to share it with anyone else, as well as any of the resources. So Candace and Eva, if there's any additional things that you want to share with us, let me know.
Okay.
I will share my screen. Let's see if I can get to right on that page there. There's a few things. Like I said, I tell you what, I will send these links. These are just ones that I was finding as I was looking around. Certainly the Green Burial website there, the first one, has many of the same links as well. So
Mhm. Yes, and
Yeah,
then-
start there.
Yeah.
Candace?
And I am also, the Green Burial Council is also a nonprofit. I am part of the Green Burial Council also.
okay.
And there's a wealth of information up
Yeah,
there.
every time I was looking for something, it felt like it was bringing me back there. So I would agree with that.
Yes,
So there
it's
was
true.
a lot really
They're very,
great.
very indispensable.
Yeah,
That's
there were a
great.
lot of
Well,
really
Lisa's
great-
frozen again,
Oh
but I
my
want to
goodness.
thank everyone for joining us on this conservation conversation. I do want to also mention thank you to the Community Foundation in North Central Massachusetts, who's helping to fund our conversation series this year.
Oh, that's great.
And, you know, please do give generously this year to Green Burial Massachusetts and any other nonprofit organization that really makes you feel good. Give till it feels good, right? Because everybody is doing great work out there and we're all connected. So thank you all.
Okay.
And I want, oh, and Robin, it's very good to see you.
Yes, Robin.
I wish that we could stay on and chat with you. And do stay in touch. North County Land Trust has a lot going on, so make sure if you're not already on our newsletter, sign up and see what's going on our website. There's a lot of great stuff. So,
Thank you all.
all right,
Thank you
Great.
all.
thank
Okay.
you all.
Thank
We'll
you.
see you next time.
So you're going to send us links for the film, right? For the
I
film
will.
and the video.
We'll send everybody the links. Absolutely.
I will send it to everyone I know.
Excellent. Oh, good.
You're a star.
Well, hello
Eva.
to everyone that Eva knows then.
Thank you.
Thank you, Candace.